Hello, warm greetings to you all, the participants and the speaker and the distinguished professors and to this webinar on digital ethnography, principles and concepts. This session will be dealt by Professor Bartholomew Crispin Dean from the University of Kansas, the Department of Anthropology. So, and before I introduce the speaker, I will introduce the organization, Anthropological Association for Humankind. Anthropological Association for Humankind came into existence on 27th February this year, 2021. Since then, it began to unite anthropologists for exchange and conversation. The Anthropological Association for Humankind as an organization promotes applied anthropology. It aims to encourage new anthropological theories and develop context-specific anthropological applications in a collective effort to expand human knowledge through the anthropological applications and the of research findings and success stories through publications. Through its major applied anthropology congresses, National Applied Anthropology Congress, it will be conducted annually, and the World Applied Anthropology Congress, the Anthropology for Human, conducted once in 2 years. So through these through these congresses, we want to promote and provide a forum to enhance knowledge exchange and communication between academic anthropologists and applied anthropologists of all regions of the world. Anthropological Association for Humankind came into existence to engage with contemporary issues and challenges through a dialogue between academic scholarship, applied practice, and intervention in public sphere. Anthropological scholarship yields insights into social and cultural context. Context matters in helping multinational corporations understand that responsible business conduct depends on understanding the local and regional conditions under which supply chain management, production, distribution, and consumption operate. Context matters in helping the government policy-making apparatus understand how proposed policies contribute to more just and sustainable livelihoods for all. Context matters in helping NGOs advocate for and service the disadvantaged and unrepresented peoples. Spreads the anthropological applications to unleash and harness the human potential to inspire excellence, solve real-world problems, and help humans what they are capable of becoming for making a positive difference in the world. Explores the compelling ways how anthropological knowledge, skills, and methodologies can be put to work in addressing social, cultural, and economic, health, climate, moral, intellectual, emotional, and emerging new technological problems. It focuses on every sphere of applied anthropological domains, includes development, agriculture, environment, health, and medicine, nutrition, population, displacement, and resettlement, business and industry, education and aging, medicine, engineering, architecture, designing, and addressing poverty, suffering, corruption, addiction, suicides, crimes, human crisis, and depravity, and every sphere of human life to improve the human condition on this planet. So with this intention, the Anthropological Association for Humankind was formed, and there is the wonderful, distinguished academicians and practitioners of anthropology. are there on the governing council and advisory council. With their support and wisdom and guidance, this organization has created a virtual institute called International Institute of Anthropological Applications. International Institute of Anthropological Applications, IIAA, is a virtual institute that trains students, scholars, and faculty members and practitioners to look at societies holistically, to respect cultural differences, and to learn about social phenomena through a careful process of participant observation and interviewing. It equips them in the investigation of the principles of human acquisition and behavior and the application of these principles to address contemporary issues and problems. IIAA uses action-oriented anthropology to catalyze positive change that creates a safe, just, and inclusive world. Making positive change involves making things personal and professional commitment, active listening, advocacy, teaching and training, policy work through networking, collaboration, grassroots and community-based and collective efforts. Students who are trained at the International Institute of Anthropological Applications can take on very different roles in their career directions, such as researchers, policy analysts, program evaluators, needs assessors, impact assessors, community advocates, trainers, cultural brokers, managers, change agents, consultants, etc. Anthropological applications can be used to solve problems in an enormous variety of fields: public health and medicine, business, law, human rights, education, environmental issues, community development, museums, disaster research and management, the government and international development concerns. IIAA promotes a human-centered work applied to practical problems by linking a network of professional anthropologists working across employment sectors. We support all anthropologists in bringing real solutions to communities, organizations, and policymakers by offering advocacy, information, networks, mentoring, continuing education. We look forward to collaborating and connecting applied anthropologists worldwide and other applied sciences to address the urgent and important challenges that lasting change demands. It encourages us to work together to make a just world. The unifying factor is a commitment to make a positive impact on the quality life in the world. The association also asserts that anthropology's ability to collect, store data at all is a privilege, and researchers have an ethical duty to store the digital data responsibly. This means protecting the identity of participants, sharing data with the other anthropologists, and making backup copies of all data. So with this brief introduction, I now introduce our speaker for this webinar on digital ethnography, principles and concepts. So our distinguished speaker, Professor Bartholomew Crispin Dean, sir, he obtained his PhD from Harvard University, and he obtained his MPhil from Oxford University, and he did his obtained his master's degree from Harvard University, and also he obtained his bachelor's degree from Washington University. So his areas of specialization: Social anthropology, critical theory, political anthropology, human rights, and ethnography, ethnohistory, kinship and political economy, symbolic forms, global health, indigenous peoples, and identity politics, mobility studies, and urbanization, material culture, memory and museology, governance and citizenship, and post-colonialism, violence, and social trauma and reconciliation, advocacy, intellectual history, and ethics of anthropology. So these are his specializations and his regional foci on Latin America and Caribbean, Peruvian Amazonia, and Andean South America, Mexico, and Hispaniola. He's so he's the Director of Public Anthropology Programs, Kansas University Institute for Policy and Social Research. And he is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Kansas. And Professor Dean is a research associate of Kansas University's Laboratory of Biological Anthropology, as well as a research affiliate at the Universidad Nacional de San Martin, Tarapoto, and Peru, and a contributing editor for Lowland South America and Library of Congress. Professor Dean is the author of the State and the Awajun Frontier Expansion in the Upper Amazon, 1541 to 1990. Urarina Society, Cosmology and History in Peruvian Amazonia, and co-editor of At the Risk of Being Heard, Identity, Indigenous Rights, and the Post-Colonial States. He is currently completing the book Machetes in Our Hands, Blood on Our Faces, Trauma and Social Resilience in Peruvian Amazonia. His research interest includes ethnology of Amazonia and the anthropology of global health, human rights, politics, social theory, and ethics. In 2018, Professor Dean was awarded the Orden Mons Jose Luis Astingaraga Lizarraeld Universidad Nacional, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Alto Amazonas, Yurimaguas, Peru. So I'm sorry, it was difficult for me to pronounce. Thank you. Now he has written many books, and maybe more than 100 or 150 articles. There are lots of 27 pages of his profile is there. If I read all those things, the entire session will be finished. So the time is due to limitations of the time, I'm not able to read all his publications and books and articles. And he is also a member of editor of many international journals. And he has finished many prestigious projects, and he has many things for his credit. So I'm very excited to have him as our vice president of the Anthropological Association for Humankind. He is graciously and generously accepted to serve in the leadership team of Anthropological Association for Humankind, and he's also going to be the chairperson for the upcoming World Congress on Applied Anthropology for Human Anthropology for Humankind WACAF program, which is going to take place in 2022 at Kansas University, USA. So with this brief introduction, I request our distinguished speaker, Professor Bartholomew Crispin Dean, sir, to take time and present his lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Gotti. That was an extremely kind and very honorable presentation. I would also like to thank Professor Roy, who's in attendance, and also Professor Paul, who is one of the leaders of this movement. So I'm delighted to be amongst this esteemed crowd. And today we're going to be discussing visual anthropology, digital anthropology. I do have a presentation ready, and I do understand that a variety of you will be listening to it as if it was a podcast. So I know that Dr. Gotti will have available my PowerPoint presentation. So for those of you who will be listening, we'll be able to review this subsequently. At any point in time, if you have a question, please raise your hand or send it in chat and I will try to respond. And again, thank you very much. It's a great honor. Let me see if I can share my screen here now. Do that.
Yeah. Professor Dean, sir, I have made you host, so you can share your PowerPoint now.
Thank you ever so much. Just looking for my PowerPoint. It's here somewhere. This is one of the beauties of what we do. Here we go. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Pardon me. No, that's the wrong one again. I'm a paper man, not a digital man, unfortunately. I'll find it in here in a moment. Here to my finder. This is the interesting thing. I have it recent, should be under recent. Here we go. Pull it up. Wonderful. So in the background, you'll hear, well, sounds, because I think the majority of you are actually listening rather than viewing. So I'm going to start my presentation. And as my esteemed colleague has said, my name is Bartholomew Dean. I'm associated with the Department of Anthropology, and I provided you with my email contact information. In North America, many of us use email, so I would encourage you to send email to me and I will respond to any of your questions. Today, I would really like to give a demonstration of the importance of what Dr. Gotti has discussed. And I have a specific topic, which is really looking at cinematography and what I call whiteness in a region called Amazonia, which is the Amazon, and how we visualize this notion of whiteness by studying cinema, by studying films. So by listening today, I want you to listen to a number of themes, but you will also have access to a film, which is a very famous film. My hope is by watching this film subsequently and listening to what I say today, you will view the world in a different way. So the question that I have for you is, how have peoples in the Amazon been portrayed in film? I live in a country that is dominated by Hollywood. I tend to think that you live in a country that is dominated by Bollywood, but I don't know. I have spent limited time in India. This brings up the question of Edward Said, who wrote a very important text, simply put, Orientalism, which is a critique of the representation of, quote, the Orient. And that refers in Western scholarship, and I mean primarily French or British scholarship. And Edward Said lived between 1935 and 2003. And he discusses the impact of the representation going much beyond the academy. The networks of its associations provide rationale for the Western European and Anglo-American colonial domination of the so-called global South. And I'm discussing something I'm sure that many of you do know, so that the Orient for Said, and note this is for Said and others in the so-called West, we can discuss Occidentalism. The Orient represents everything that is the Occident is not. So Orientalists institutionalized, the us versus them colonial mentality. And that's a very, very important argument associated with Edward Said, a fantastic thinker. Now, this is a visual demonstration, and I do understand that many of you are listening to this, so it will be difficult for you to imagine this, but unless you're familiar with his work. And I have some images of Orientalism. But getting back to my main point here, how have Amazonian peoples been portrayed in film, in media? Which brings up the concept of alterity. And alterity simply means the state of being other or different. So using film to explore the visual aspects of alterity, we become cognizant of each other and how we perceive and judge another person in a visual field. Simply put, there is no, quote, natural, end quote, sight. So we all see in a particular, from a particular vantage point, through a specific apparatus, film, photography, digital world. So we're seeing, those who of us can see. There's another example of Orientalism in movies. Aventure in Oriente, Elvis Presley. Getting back to the main point of this discussion, this seminar, is cinematography and visualizing what I say is whiteness in the Amazon. Well, the film I'm going to discuss today is a film called Fitzcarraldo, which was a 1982 film, a West German film, written and directed by Werner Herzog, and it starred Klaus Kinski, who is the character, the primary character. Deals with the rubber boom. And I also, if I do have time, talk about this concept of guns for heads. Guns for head. Recall Marcel Mauss and circulation. Which brings up the larger, really theoretical concept that I'm concerned with by discussing digital ethnography, which brings up the issue of critical whiteness studies. And this means the analysis of the mechanisms that we create white privilege. The review of what whiteness is when analyzed as a race, as a community, and as a source of structural racism. Critical whiteness studies refers to the exploration of other social phenomena produced by the cultural compositions, attitudes, and group behaviors of white people. We can think of critical race theory, CRT, it's very early where I am. This refers to an interdisciplinary approach which endeavors to understand and fight race inequity in society. CRT views race as a socially constructed identity formation that is by and large unrecognized by most of society. Rather than viewing racism as an individual manifestation of discrimination, scapegoating, hatred, this theory, critical race theory, which is heavily debated in North America, but CRT illuminates the social structuring of racism as a complex, changing, and often subtle aspect of society that operates to the benefit of white people. especially white elites, e.g. white privilege. We can think about this in the context of North America or Europe, Western Anglo-Saxon Europe, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, BLM. But let's get back to the main point of this seminar, which is digital ethnography. 10 years after a very important film by Werner Herzog, a film called Aguirre, The Wrath of God, which also starred Klaus Kinski, they returned to the Amazon. And this time for the tale of an opera-based entrepreneur in the turn of the century, Peru. An opera singer in Peru? Well, I'm sorry for those of you who are listening via podcast, but you will not be able to see this visual image, a very striking image. Fitzcarraldo is a stunning, grandiose, deeply disturbing film shot under horrendous conditions. It took 4 years to make, 3 changes of cast. It was at one point disrupted by a war between Ecuador and Peru. Ecuador and Peru are neighbors, and they've been at war for many, many years. It's one of the longest standing wars in all of the Americas. Here you see an image from the filming. So the filming of Fitzcarraldo is associated with significant disruptions of a group of people called the Aguajún. And I'm mentioning this, the Aguajún is the Aguajún, the Aguaruna, the Jivaroan peoples disturbed their traditional ways of life. Burning of the film camp was the first attempt at the filming by the Aguajún. So we see this actually in the film. There's the deaths of several of the Aguajún extras. So this is a film that had extras in it. Indigenous peoples died making this as, quote, extras, end quote. Here you see a visual image of the film in process. Now, this scandal was cleared by Amnesty International of any crime.
Professor Dean, we are not able to see the visuals.
Oh, we're not able to see the visuals. Oh, dreadful.
Share your screen. Share your screen.
Oh, this is dreadful. Oh, okay, let me share my screen.
In the lower bar,
Yes,
there will be.
I'm sorry. You're right. I'm sorry, and I do know how to do this. I'm just a bit. Did under security? Dr. Gotti, could you help me in terms of where? Oh, I see. There it is. Pardon me. This is foolish of me. Okay, there we go. There we go. Is that better? That's much better. It should be. Laugh to myself. I think this is okay.
Yeah, we are able to see now.
Yeah, and pardon me. This shows that Dr. Gotti, as I had mentioned before, I'm a man of paper. I'm not really a man of digital. I do photography. So this should help. And I will go back so that very quickly, so that those of you who would like to see what I was just very quickly. That was the first image of me. That's Edward Said. This is the image of what I was discussing in terms of Orientalism visually. Oops. And this is the film we were discussing. You see this Fitzcarraldo. You see the construction of the film, and that's where I really stopped, I do believe. So the the filming was cleared by Amnesty International of any so-called crimes. And I would want to mention Amnesty International, an extremely important non-governmental organization that's celebrating 60 years. But there's doubts about some of the questionable business aspects that were associated with the filming of this very important international. Here we see Klaus Kinski, and he's taken a historical narrative, and we see a hybrid of two sorts of, oh, I'm gonna have to minimize this, pardon me, it's very hard for me to understand what I'm doing. There we go. So he's taken a historical narrative and he's hybridized it with two cliches. The stock character of the dreamer, hatching myriad get-rich schemes, and the notion of taming a ferocious beast with music. And this comes from the work of Trevor Cunnington, and I will mention him, and I'll give you his citation in a moment. So according to Cunnington, this film manages to subvert aspects of white supremacist ideology. And this comes from a text, an article called The White Moon, Whiteness, Modernization, Hybridity, and the Agwaruna, or the Agwahun, a text of a book that Dr. Gotti mentioned I had written about. This is an article published in the Quarterly Review of Film and Video in 2014. And let me read you something that Trevor Cunnington, Dr. Cunnington, wrote. While the main character is depicted sympathetically, and he certainly is contaminated by colonial fantasies, the Agwaruna exercise their agency in the end in a very empathetic fashion, adding to their incineration of the film camp as an act of war. It's subversive. Now, in this film, we see operatic excess. It's both the subject and the keynote as Kinski's visionary adventure obsessively hatches grandiose schemes to finance a dream of bringing none other than Enrico Caruso and the music of Verdi to Iquitos, an Amazonian trading post. Brian Sweeney, or the infamous Fitzcarraldo, is based on Fitzgerald, an Irishman living in Iquitos in the early part of the 20th century, when the city grew exponentially thanks to the rubber boom. In the film, one notes this futile effort to build a trans-Andean railway. And I don't need to tell Indians the importance of railways. Well, his efforts failed. He only was able to lay a few yards of track, and there was a single locomotive sitting on them. He also has an effort to try to create ice. It fails. He's failing. He's failing at ice making in the tropics. He has grand dreams. And the image to the left is the Opera House in Manaus, Brazil. He wants that. So his goal is to make enough money, driven by avarice, to build an opera house in Iquitos, more lavish than the one in Manaus. Why? He wants to import a company of singers headed by Enrico Caruso, whose records he plays on what appears to be RCA's first Victrola. Now, in his wild endeavor, he has the patient, loving support of Molly. That's played by Claudia Cardinal. She's the madam of the most popular brothel in Iquitos, who in her own way is touched by the madness that inspires Fitzcarraldo. Dun, 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 the opera house. So he's determined to build a performance space that would attract top European singers to his river outpost. He tries to raise the necessary funds by what? By harvesting rubber in an isolated corner of the jungle made unreachable by a series of rapids. Now, the intellectual Trevor Cunnington, who's written about this film, and this is the point, we can write, we can analyze films. We must deconstruct visual fields. So Professor Cunnington claims that the only reason Fitzcarraldo, quote, the only reason Fitzcarraldo wants to get rich is to bring the opera and an embodiment of the cultural cachet of Western civilization to Iquitos, end quote. Now, this is Cunnington's argument. One does not need to agree with it. I would encourage you to view this film and make your own decision. Is Cunnington right? And I ask you this in a fashion that's called the Socratic Method. So here we see the marketing of the film in German. Fitzcarraldo leases an inaccessible parcel of land from the government in an effort to fulfill his dream. There he is visually, we see him with the madam. His paramour, Molly, and she's a successful brothel owner. She funds the purchase of his steamship. He names it SS Molly Ida. As we know, ships must bear the name of a woman. Or am I right? Or am I wrong? Well, this is monumental, truly. Bankrolled by Molly, he pilots the resurrected river tub. It's really a river tub. It's the Molly Ida down an uncharted tributary in search of untapped rubber. He subdues hostile native peoples with a gramophone areas before securing their inexplicable collaboration in the ludicrous task of hauling the ship manually over a massive hill towards a parallel waterway. And here you see an actual image of Aguajún peoples doing this task. So this effort, essentially recreated by Herzog in real life, is the heart of the film, and what understandably has made the production a legend, as well as the target of critics who question the safety and the ethics of such filmmaking, particularly when it comes to the use of indigenous or of local peoples. What are the ethics of using locals as extras? Notice I use the term extras as if they're disposable. There he is, dun dun dun. So the ported section of the film is a massive undertaking of engineering, of human labor, and Herzog employs long shots and aerial footage to capture the sense of immensity. So Herzog is brilliant when it comes to cinematography, but I question as an anthropologist his ethics. So when the massive ship begins inching up the hill, one can't help but share in Fitzcarraldo's elation. We're sucked into it. Visually, I am, but then that makes me question, as Dr. Gotti wisely said, anthropology is a moral field. We must question the ethics of this. The crew falls asleep after a drunken celebration. The chief of the natives helping Fitzcarraldo cuts the rope securing the ship to the shore. It floats down the river. The chief wanted to appease the river spirits, who would otherwise be angered, because Fitzcarraldo defied nature by circumventing them. One cannot defy nature. So this is a film about humans' efforts to defy nature. Here we see Klaus Kinski with the gramophone. So the movie is full of other arresting moments that capture both the bravado and the danger of the protagonist's determination. Chugging down the river to the portage site, Fitzcarraldo and his crew hear ominous drums. Boom, 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 emanating from the thick forest on the river banks. He responds by what? By taking a gramophone to the ship. He takes it to the roof and he blasts Caruso back into the jungle. Fitzcarraldo's notion is to tame, quote, the beast, end quote. The hero with music. And this constitutes the film's second cliche. It's a cliche. It's ridiculous, taming the beast with music. And this is noted by Cunnington. Here we see another critical figure within the film. And to deconstruct this figure, one understands the tragedy of a country I know well called Peru, which is currently celebrating 200 years of national independence. Dr. Gotti discussed some of my work, which is about post-colonialism. Do we put a hyphen in post-colonialism? Do we talk about neon? Do we just simply call it colonialism? We need to talk about race. Anthropology had a hand in creating this, but I'm very, very, very proud to be a student in the Boasian tradition, Franz Boas, who challenged this. So this brings up a key term, a term that is used in many parts of the Spanish-speaking world, the Spanish-speaking Americas, cholo, and that's the figure within the film. And according to Cunnington, cholo, the character, has attained a level of competence in mechanical arts with regards to the steamship that suggests successful enculturation in the colonial power structure. So it's through his competence in the mechanical arts. Now, Cholo's role is important as his representation provides a counterpoint for the representation of the hero, of the Aguahum, who are depicted as having totally rejected the power structure of national society. Interpretation. We as anthropologists interpret. There's a figure, who serves as the interpreter. And here, my friends, my colleagues, I counsel to think carefully about the difference between interpretation and translation. Literal translation versus interpretation, quite different. So this gentleman who we see to the left with the teeth around his neck is critical. He mediates between the world of the hero and this mixture of this Irish Dutch of the masters of the voyage. He's in between these worlds. He's what we would call the cultural hybrid. He draws upon two different bodies of sociocultural knowledge, has insight necessary to ultimately solve the problem facing the crew. He's pivotal. Now, if I were to take you to Amazonia today and it was nighttime, oh, we could go there. That's what it would look like. It would frighten me if I didn't know where I was going. In the film, members, they begin questioning the judgment of Fitzcarraldo. I would. He's a madman. There's an eerie scene in which they slowly withdraw from the circle of light being cast by his kerosene lamp, disappearing back into the darkness. Now, as for Kinski, he's a different sort of deranged character compared to the wild-eyed insanity of Aguirre. And I mentioned Aguirre, Wrath of Gods, which is a documentation of what? It's the documentation of the domination of the Inca, I could say, of the Spanish. Pardon me, of the Spanish, the brother of Francisco Pizarro, heads up the mountains, and he discovers what quotes around the Amazon. But in so doing, he dies. But that's the earlier, a few hundred years before. Well, let's get back to the film. The film really is not about Aguirre, Wrath of Gods. This film is about Fitzcarraldo, who is portrayed as a clownish figure. He's even pitiable. We note this in early party scene. He's an Araviste. He tries to pitch to fellow businessmen about his opera house, but his efforts to pitch this go disastrously wrong. They laugh him out of the room. There he is, the icon of the colonial figure, the pith helmet. Well, it's not a pith helmet, it's a Panama hat. Now, critics have noted an odd tension in Fitzcarraldo's character in that his colonialist capitalist impulses are undeniably destructive, yet they're ultimately in service of life-giving art, of opera. This is the dialectic. Note it's a German film, dialectical materialism. Here we see from the film the image of the craft. So as for the film's finale, while recognizes Fitzcarraldo's failure in one sense, it also offers him vindication in that the opera, by other means, does come to town. It's a stunning image. Fitzcarraldo is a tragedy. Everyone and everything, from Fitzcarraldo to his crew, to the Aguahun, to the jungle itself, must suffer. So overcoming his own disparaged image as an inspired madman, Herzog perversely illuminates colonialism with surrealism. He demonstrates the irresistible way that, quote, only dreamers move mountains. Very important. I'll repeat that. Only dreamers move mountains. Keep in mind, trying to haul a large ship across a mountain. And by viewing the film, you'll understand why he tried to do this. There you see him. Now, the film underscores whiteness emanating from Fitzcarraldo's physicality. You could talk in biological anthropology, phenotypes, genotypes. Well, it's phenotype, his physicality. We see it in his clothing, in his hair, his whiteness in his hair. Now, Cunnington claims that Fitzcarraldo is a negative example of the white colonial agent. Why? This is a white colonial agent who lacks socioeconomic competence, lacks cultural authority. So phenotypically darker Peruvian ruling class represent the more socioeconomic competence, the cultural authority to which Fitzcarraldo actually aspires. And this within anthropology brings up the concepts of social Darwinism, which we really don't need to spend much time on. Social Darwinism provided justification to the colonial project, the survival of the fittest. The fact of colonial subjugation was ample evidence of the superiority of the, quote, white races, end quote, while the, quote, heathen hordes, end quote, and the missionary project of saving souls provided more theological framework for the colonial project. And this is Trevor Cunnington's argument, which I agree with. So there are a number of tropes, metaphors. The film Fitzcarraldo is a film about colonial encounters. And pardon me, because I have in the PowerPoint colonial encounter. It's really about an S, colonial encounters. Peru, it's an independent nation, but the relationship between the Peruvian government and the majority of the peoples, the indigenous populations, is deeply colonial in character. Another trope we note is the condescending attitude of the colonials and whites towards the Jívaro. They're called, quote, bare asses, end quote. The parceling out of land to men who might develop it and exploit the natural and cultural resources is shown when the bureaucrat legally gives Fitzcarraldo the right to tap the rubber trees adjacent to a river called the Ucayale above the water rapids, the Pongo. We note the visit with the missionaries on Fitzcarraldo's way to claim the lands. So there are metaphors of encounter between Europeans and indigenous peoples, tribal peoples. The indigenous awe of the so-called white men, inspired through technological display and mastery of natural forces. And these are interpreted as, quote, magic, or as the control of animistic spirits. Now, Fitzcarraldo plans to take advantage of what? Of white privilege, of the visual quality of his Nordic whiteness. He's wise. He's using something called strategic essentialism. He's not a fool. He's using his white privilege. He heard that there was a myth about the coming of a white god who would rid the ills from the land. This is a myth he heard from the locals, the Jivaroan peoples had. So whiteness in this film takes on several different meanings. It's embodied in the physical presence of Fitzcarraldo. White signifies cultural authority and power. Whiteness is associated with social power, with decision-making, capacity, assertiveness, ownership, subjugation of land, and of the moon, of ice. These are key tropes within the film one sees differently by deconstructing the film ethnographically. And that's the importance of this institute. These are images, now photographic images, that I would counsel you likewise to deconstruct. The rubber boom occurred roughly from 1879 to 1912. and it was a very important part of the economic and social history of Amazonia. The boom resulted in a large expansion of European colonialism. It attracted immigrant workers, it produced wealth, but in so doing, it unleashed incredible sociocultural transformations, erect violence and havoc upon indigenous societies. The image to your far right is an image from the Putumayo scandals, and these are Bora peoples enslaved with chains around their neck. And that image is roughly less, we can find out, but less than 100 years old. Slavery, less than 100 years old. Well, this is a place I know well. This is in Iquitos. Currently, that would be, well, I'm not sure where it is currently. It was multiple things, but it was the consequence, certainly, of the urbanization of Amazonia, thanks to the rubber boom. And the rubber boom encouraged the growth of cities such as Manaus, Belém in Brazil, many cities throughout Amazonia, Iquitos in Peru, Leticia in Colombia. Rubber, what is known today as the rubber boom, had its origin in the middle of the 19th century, with Charles Goodyear's discovery that cooking and treating latex harvested from rubber trees turned it into a product with a huge range of potential uses. With Henry Ford's mass production of the automobile a few decades later, and the invention of tires by John Dunlop in 1888, the need for rubber suddenly became extremely pressing. And the image that you see in the middle now is from the people who produced or provided the supply for that incredible demand. So as a result, thousands of Amazonian peoples were enslaved or were killed during this horrific, this mad rush to extract natural rubber, hence the rubber boom. Here you see, and I don't need to tell many people in this audience how to tap rubber. The rubber tree grown in profusion in Amazonia, particularly in the western fringes of Amazonia. So there was a veritable rubber rush on, like the gold rush in San Francisco in 1849. Oh, there they are. Dun, dun, dun. The beneficiaries of this. And I encourage you to deconstruct these images. Dr. Gotti had mentioned that I'm an editor of the Library of Congress. That is correct. The Library of Congress, to my knowledge, is the largest library on the planet. It has an incredible amount of photographic archives. But so too, there must be archives that I have no idea about. So I encourage you to search through them, deconstruct your own histories, histories of others. Here we see entrepreneurs, fortune seekers set off into the steamy jungle, determined to cash in. And I'm using American English now, to cash in and to bring with them civilization, civilization, British English. Who are they civilizing? Well, unaware of the impending disaster, tens of thousands of indigenous peoples from Western Amazonia were about to experience social and cultural devastation. And if you don't believe me, this is documented. The Putumayo, and that is a region currently between Peru and Colombia. This region has the most, I'd say, documented cases of violence and abuses during the rubber boom. There was a company called the Peruvian Amazon Company, PAC, and it operated in the region and it exported rubber from Iquitos to Europe. And friends, if we were to fly over in an aircraft, we would see the beauty of the Amazon. And unfortunately, climatic change is making that less green, all the more important to discuss applied anthropology. Applied anthropology. You must take our tools and change the world because the world doesn't look so good. So the administrative arrangement of the rubber boom was characterized by a form of contracting out. The Peruvian government owned vast amounts of public land. Public land? No, the lands were occupied by indigenous peoples for millennia. The first peoples that came to South America, archaeologists tell us, maybe 60,000 years ago. We don't quite know. So it's ridiculous from my point of view as a public anthropologist to claim that the Peruvian government owned vast amounts of public land. I say that, my friends, because these are the battles that continue. It's the fight over land. Here we see an image of rubber tappers. Landowners hired managerial henchmen called patrones, Spanish. They arranged for indigenous peoples to tap the landowners' rubber trees and to enforce the arduous work schedule. So during the first decade of the 20th century, it's estimated that roughly 4,000 tons of crude rubber had been extracted, while up to at least 40,000 indigenous peoples likely died. At least. We don't know. That's the beauty. The wealthy Europeans owned the export houses, the contracted river merchants to navigate the Amazon tributary system, buying the rubbers. The larger rubber enterprises, such as the Peruvian Amazon Rubber Company, handled shipping internally rather than relying on river merchants hired by the export houses. Rubber tappers existed, we know. Workers always exist at the bottom of the pyramid. They suffered at the abuses at the hands of the cruel bosses who demanded strict order in production. And pardon me, the image that you see, this is a lithograph. And so I would also encourage you to be deconstructing photography films, but also European lithographs, printing. Here's a photographic image. So a little over 100 years ago, in March 1913, one of the least known and most disturbing episodes in British colonial history were brought to light in the courtroom. The law of the jungle. I like laws, but I don't. Here we see the Peruvian Amazon Rubber Company, and it had been charged by the High Court. Yet the only hint at its dark secrets being a remark that the judge said. The judge says what? It was impossible to acquit the partners of knowledge of the way in which the rubber had been collected for the company. And pardon me if this is confusing, but there is a voluminous, historical, visual record which will empirically demonstrate what I am telling you is truthful. It is not my opinion. This gentleman existed, Julio C. Arana. Julio C. Arana. There he is. He was one of the most treasure seekers. He wanted to make his fortune. He's a Peruvian trader. Well, this is another image, legitimate image. Arana acquired vast estates in a region named after its largest river, the Putumayo. And as many others were doing at the time, he enslaved vast numbers of the local native peoples to collect the rubber. Note carefully, deconstruct the images. It's hard to do this, I know, because they're grainy, and for a number of you do not have access to the visual field. That is difficult, but try to imagine. Arana and his brother moved quickly, bringing to Peru from where? From Barbados. Barbados, a large number of overseers, well used to cracking the whip on workers in the sugarcane estates. That should tell you something right there. It's the Brits, Barbados, steamships. They couldn't get their steamships all the way up the Amazon without stopping. So they stopped in Barbados to refuel and to pick up the overseers, the muchachos. Here you see the rubber camps, the bora, the witoto, in the Putumayo Basin were soon enslaved, and those who escaped the appalling treatment inflicted on them quickly fell victim to the waves of epidemics. They're brought into remote rivers by traders and rubber tappers. It's disease that kills. More images of the wrath. It was a horrific time. So in a few short years, thousands of native Amazonian peoples were killed or died from mistreatment, hunger, disease. This is documented in Walter Hardenberg's book, The Putumayo, The Devil's Paradise. So the outside world remained completely unaware of the horrors of this, of the bros, of the Arana brothers' empire, until 1909, when Walter Hardenberg wrote several articles for the magazine Truth. Walter Hardenberg was an American railway engineer, and he traveled to Colombia. And while traveling down the Putumayo, he entered into the concession of the Peruvian company. His account of the abuses he had witnessed makes horrifying reading even today. And I'm not going to read this to you because I don't want to. I'll simply say they're left to die, eaten by maggots. Here we see a visual image. So Hardenberg witnessed sights he didn't think possible in the 20th century. He was shocked. He was a North American. He's like, wow, this is impossible. Now, in his country, in North America, slavery ostensibly was over in 1865. But as we know, as I said before, in the United States, they've had significant problems with civil rights. There's a movement called Black Lives Matter. It's still at the forefront of political conflict. So hundreds of indigenous peoples, they were flogged. They had to carry heavy balls of untreated rubber, supplies into warehouses controlled by what? By what are called the muchachos, the young men. And they were young Barbadian gang masters who had been recruited by the owners of the Peruvian Amazon Rubber Company, Julio Cesar Arana. Cesar, the Roman Empire. Tragic how we repeat history. Here you see them rounding them up. Dun-da-da, in London, the Anti-Slavery and Aborigine Society took action after becoming aware of Hardenberg's truth articles. They put pressure on the British Foreign Office to look into the activities of the British companies in the Amazon. News of the atrocities came as a dreadful embarrassment to the British establishment, its image management. In 1907, the brothers were summoned to London. No, they were not summoned to London. They went to London. Why? They wanted to raise capital. They were looking for money. They had stories of immense fortunes. Most people in London knew nothing about this. They were a willing audience. In this part of the world, you could say they were hoodwinked. They were tricked. Ha ha, I want to make money. In this country, there's a place called Wall Street. Wall Street. Well, in London, there's a different place. But I encourage you all to think, why did they call it Wall Street? Words matter. Well, the Peruvian Amazon company had been registered in Britain in 1908. Oh, Iran had come over looking for capital. Now we had a British board of directors, numerous stockholders. It's all proper. He had listed on the London Stock Exchange. He had the backing of £1 million. £1 million is a substantial amount of capital in 1908. Wow, I know that place well. Now, eventually, there were reports, as I discussed, reports of exploitation, of maltreatment of indigenous peoples in this region. And eventually it reaches London, and the PAC and the Peruvian government, of course, they deny allegations. No, we didn't do it. It has nothing to do with us. But there is outcry over Hardenberg's testimony. There's anxious debate in British Parliament. There's growing public outcry. And the government eventually, they have to listen. And this comes back to Professor Gotti's discussion of a title of a text I wrote, At the Risk of Being Heard. The foreword of that was written by a woman by the name of Winona LaDuke. And Winona LaDuke was the vice presidential candidate a number of years ago for the United States. She's a Native American. Some parts of the world, speaking your identity leads to death. So it's risky to speak out. But if you don't speak, you're trampled upon. So in this moment, the world, they heard voices, and the voices were transmitted by an American, a journalist, who was picked up, and an investigation begins. And I mentioned Barbados before. Visually, you see Barbados here on a map. So these slides will be made available. I'm sure Dr. Gotti and our gracious director, Dr. Paul, will make sure that that is the case. So the British consul in Iquitos had said that the Barbadians considered at this point British subjects as part of the empire. And they had been ill-treated while working for the PAC, which gave the government a reason to intervene. Hence, the Brits can intervene now. One of its members was the British consul in Rio, the Irishman, Roger Casement. And there you see Roger Casement. He travels extensively throughout the Putumayo. And this Irishman upheld Hardenberg's account. He said, yes, the American, he was right. But he had even more shocking detail. This is the power of investigation. Well, the Prime Minister heard at Asquith. He sets up a parliamentary select committee to decide what should be done. What should we do? Ultimately, the committee's report indicted the directors of the company. But no, the directors, quote, who merely attended board meetings and signed checks, cannot escape their share of the collective moral responsibility. I love it. I think that this makes sense. Collective moral responsibility. Well, the investigation concluded that Julio C. Arana, quote, and this is the investigation, had knowledge of and was responsible for the atrocities perpetrated by his agents and employees in the Putumayo. Parliament condemned the atrocities perpetrated by the company. Yet they discovered the Peruvian Amazon company's president and board of directors not to be criminally liable under the Slave Trade Act. That's convenient. I wonder why that happened, I asked. Perhaps we should ask Walter Benjamin, but that's another story. So, however, the writing was on the wall, not just for the Arana company, but for the Amazonian rubber boom itself. It was about to collapse. Rubber tree seedlings brought from the Amazon to London. Well, they were smuggled out to Kew Gardens. And they eventually traveled to Sri Lanka, to Malaysia, where they successfully propagate them. A very different form of labor. In Amazonia, they're not domesticated. So within a very few years, we have vast plantations. They're established in Southeast Asia. And so this Amazonian empire built by Arana and others like him, which were portrayed in this film Fitzcarraldo, come crashing down. The scandal caused major losses in business to the company. Rubber demand was met by farmers in other parts of the world. So this is a story of globalization, but it's really a story about work. We all have to work, and we all need dignity. So it's about ethics. Is money more important? Some of the PSA men exposed as killers in the 1910 report were charged by Peru. They were killers. Most fled the region, never captured. There he is. With the collapse of the business, the PAC, most foreigners left Iquitos, and they quickly returned to his former status as an isolated backwater. So the head of the company, he's never prosecuted. He lives in London for years. He returns when he wants to Peru. Despite the scandal associated with the Casement report, international pressure on the Peruvian government to change conditions, this gentleman had a very successful political career. He's elected as senator. He dies in Lima in 1952 at 88 years of age. So for indigenous peoples, the rubber boom, they were victimized, and the consequences have been far-reaching. But indigenous groups, peoples of Amazonia have not been wiped out. That's a myth. just been erased. If we watch Hollywood, we get that impression. Or if we read National Geographic and its airbrushes, we get a very different view. So groups like the Witoto-Andoke, they do survive today. They've endured for generations, but atrocities. And these atrocities remain vivid in their memories. Some indigenous groups of lowland South America, the interfluvial hunting societies, like the Jê-speaking peoples of central Brazil. I mentioned the Jê peoples. My advisor, Dr. David Maybury Lewis, a student of Evans Pritchard, was a specialist on the Jê peoples. Other groups in the Upper Xingu, they did escape. So not all groups had the force, we should say, of the full brunt of the rubber boom. So compared with the Witoto, the Bore, and note I use the term Indians. Indians, a paradox, isn't it? The West Indies, the East Indies. Well, when the Europeans sailed, as we know, they thought they were going to India. Ridiculous form of arrogance. So this isn't to suggest internationally that trade hasn't changed Hebrew societies. Of course it did. See trade goods there. The rubber boom marked the beginning of a major influx of what? Of trade goods. So with the rubber boom, the Hebrew peoples transformed themselves. And an important thing I would like to bring up is the role of shotguns. Guns came into their territory. So with the rubber boom, we see increased gun availability, resulted in significant changes in local or Hebrew warfare patterns. The introduction of the Remington, it transformed spears. And this is something that I'm a political anthropologist. I study the transformation of violence. So shotguns replaced spears as defensive mechanisms. They changed to accommodate new forms of aggression. And notice long distance head taking raids become much more common. Why? Weapons become readily available. And those with guns annihilated those without them. The increased demand for guns prompted further head-taking raids. I keep on talking about heads. These are called tsetsana. These are so-called shrunken heads that are in major ethnographic museums across the planet. So in 1925, we note 2 Aguahun war leaders are said to have taken over 50 heads in the preceding decade or so. An accomplishment that makes sense only within the context of the guns for head trade. This is a foreign-inspired commercial trade in so-called shrunken head trophies, satsana. And it contributed to a vicious cycle of raiding that was only broken by extreme demographic decline. Karsten, he writes that it was, quote, especially North Americans who would offer a rifle for each trophy head, end quote, and concludes that the market was an important catalyst to Aguahun raiding from 1916 to 1928. So local indigenous communities were eventually obliterated after there were simply too few to carry on the retaliatory cycles of blood feuding and head taking. And my question to my students, and I typically would give a lecture like this to 200, 300, 400 students in North America, and I asked them who were the real savages in this history of the trade of guns for heads. Those of you who can see this will see images now of a magazine for men only, Island of Strange Women. This is an image of a book, The Hevero, Among the Head Shrinkers of the Amazon. This is deeply, deeply, deeply insulting to the Agwahun, profoundly, but it sells. So the Hevero speaking groups, their languages, it's just not one group. They've earned their reputation as ferocious warriors in the context of the rubber boom and the weapons for the Tsatsana trade. It's an ironic tragedy, really. It's the modernist cosmopolitan consumption that, quote, our archetypal Hevero and headhunter becomes a specialist in his violence. It's really this Western demand for exotica. We see the capitalization of the killer. And this is a notion that Brian Ferguson brings in 1990. That's a long time ago. That's 30 years ago. Well, for me, it's a long time. Go to the text part, read the texts. Well, we're surrounded by this all the time, surrounded by headhunters. Well, that's the end of my lecture, and thank you very much. So, Dr. Gotti, if there are questions, I'd be more than happy to respond. And I apologize for providing a visual, but that's the nature of digital ethnography to some extent. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Bart, for your excellent presentation and brilliant construction of the past through the visual anthropological inputs and bringing the history to be digitalized through this process of your brilliant articulation and the narrating the story and the important events and the connections. And it's brilliantly weaving the entire story, how things happened in the past and now it is digitalized and it will be archived for the future reference. So this is an amazing contribution. Thank you for your seminal contribution for this digital archived. It will be archived and it will be available for future reference. And this is the digitalization of the historical events and experiences and how the stories and the sufferings and untold stories in the darkness and how violence was prevailing due to the money makers and the profit makers at the cost of the lives of the indigenous communities. So now the world will hear their story, their suffering, how the exploitation was perpetuated with this colonial intrusion, all those things. So yeah, thank you for brilliant articulation and presentation. And yeah, thank you so much. Now this is time for our participants to pose the questions related to the presentation. Please unmute your mic and then pose your question to the Professor Dean.
I'm Dr. Pramila. Dr. Bart, I would like to know your opinion about the fact that how do you see, as a political anthropologist, do you see an end to this kind of an exploitation ever in in the future years, or do you see this exploitation of resources and exploitation of the innocent people is going to continue? What is your opinion as a political anthropologist about that?
Dr. Pandita, that's a lovely question. And I'm very fortunate to be working in a country called Peru. And as we speak, there's major political transformations. So my hope has changed. My hope is more positive. And the first time in 200 years of national history, we have a president of Peru that speaks the national language.
Oh, wow.
So it is wonderful, and his name is Castillo, and he speaks Quechua. So there's a lot of work, but and thank you, and I am very, very hopeful. Yes, so I am a part of the indigenous rights movement, which was founded a number of decades ago, which in South America was a product actually of Christianity, which is not surprising, just in terms of the transformation of ideas. So I would give you a hopeful, yes, I continue this. If we do not struggle, there will be misery forever. So thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Professor Dean, actually, my senior Dr. Pandita was asking about what are the anthropological inputs to liberate these the victims of this exploitation. That is, I think, her question. And
pardon me, Dr. Pandita. I think my response would be some of the movement that associate with people like Terrence Turner, Ash, others who used ethnography or digital ethnography from probably the 1980s. And what do I mean? They provided the tools in South America, my knowledge, with Terry Turner's work, giving the cameras to indigenous people so they could speak for themselves. And I would counsel individuals, and I can send those linkages to Professor Gade if you're not familiar with the seminal work of Terence Turner. We could go on and on. He's just one figure, and you're clearly knowledgeable about that. That would be the other thing I've been involved in is giving simple technologies like little cameras, disposable cameras, and then we pick them up later. And the idea is providing local communities with tools so they can have cultural revalorization, not to have people like me. I mean, that's my personal and political sense, to do it as an assistive fashion. I have some expertise, but this isn't my story. Really, it's not my story. And that's the problem with studying films like Fitzcarraldo. It's about Fitzcarraldo's story. And another level of reading Fitzcarraldo is really, it's not a story about that. It's a story about the Second World War and so there are many levels that one can interpret a film, and which makes it fascinating. And as I'm sure Dr. Pandita, you have interpreted this, and that's what this virtual institute makes it such a rich intellectual space for the exchange of ideas. So thank you, and pardon me if I have not addressed.
No. No, you have completely addressed, and I get the answer as hope, and that's what we strive. We have people, and we live for hope, and we work hard. Yeah. So you have addressed my question. Thank you so much.
And doctor, I think that the area that you have mentioned is one area that we must work harder on, providing the technological, the resources for communities to do exactly what you and I believe in. And that's one of the efforts that Dr. Gade, that Dr. Paul, that Professor Roy, and others associated with this esteemed movement. This is our belief. And I'm delighted that you're here listening to me, as I say in English, nammer on. So thank you very much.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Pandita.
Thank you.
Dear participants, any other person want to pose the question, please?
Yeah, I would like to make a remark.
Can I? Yeah. Can I?
Yes, sir, please carry on. Please carry on. I'll talk later.
Dr. Rajkumar will ask the question, pass the remarks after Professor S.B. Roy sir will pose the question. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay.
Professor Roy, please.
Me?
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Dean. I was engrossed listening to it, and the documentation, the picture, those were represented very well. My question as an anthropologist, I was wondering, such kind of documentation is often done by journalists. It's also done by historian. Such kind of story is also narrated by novelists who work for literature. Take a story. So what would be the difference between the documentation by an anthropologist, documentation by a journalist, and documentation by a literature historian? Do we think it will have a same kind of message to the reader, or it will be different?
Professor Roy, that's a series of wonderful questions,
Yes.
very complex. I think that when I discuss the difference between, first of all, ethnography and journalism, which we have similar tools, but I say that an ethnographer is in it for the long run. A journalist parachutes in and then leaves, and they give us a particular view of that. As you mentioned, literature, quite different. I have developed something with my colleagues that would be useful, which would be called rapid ethnographic assessment. So I could come, Professor Roy, to your area and not know enough because my memory doesn't serve me, and I could study the photographs subsequently. That would be a photographic intelligence. And the way that Boas used photography to study kinetics, to study body movement. So I think you've raised a superbly important question. Keep in mind, I am not trained as a visual anthropologist. And I am so, but I think you've raised some very, very important ones. I think that within journalism, there are debates within it. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, I think that what has brought us together is we're on the cutting edge of new technologies. I have been very uncomfortable with digital technologies. And Professor Roy, let me briefly end on to respond to your question. Years ago, I was about to do field work with the Udairina peoples. And I was contacted by the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They were very keen on doing a film about peoples like the Udairina. I was very, very uncomfortable about this because I felt I had no right to bring in a film crew. I thought that would be too overwhelming. I lied. I sent back a telegram to Toronto saying, pardon me, the ship has departed, when it departed a week later. The team arrived in Iquitos and they said, where is Bartholomew? Well, I was chugging upriver. I do not regret my decision. And so I had the Udairina maybe make National Geographic, or that's their decision. I could discuss what we're doing currently with the Udairina peoples, indigenous humanities movement, which is something much more different. I'd love to talk about that, but I think it would be important to share the floor with others, such as our esteemed colleague Raj or others who have questions. But thank you, Professor, because you've asked some of the seminal questions that we must address as active in our field. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. This is what should be the message to the anthropologists listening to us, that the anthropological approach for understanding a phenomenon must have a concept of anthropological background, the theory, the concept, which a journalist will not probe. They will just have a story. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Respected sir, I'm Shankaran speaking. Shankaran speaking, Professor Dean.
Yeah.
Professor Dean, a very good evening to you, sir.
Very good evening to you.
Yes, sir. Sir, this is related to, sir, actually, I had read some concepts of called ecological imperialism of Alfred Crosby, and I was also looking into the idea of colonial debt, and the concept of governmentality by Michel Foucault. Actually, each one of them, I feel they are interrelated to each other. From the historical thing to the synchronic present, actually, the achronic history to the synchronic present. Many people may not see the continuity within it, but I feel that these are really connected to each other. Once upon a time, there was something called an epidemic, but now we have got something called the pandemic now existing. So even now, when I sent an invitation about the digital anthropology to many other interdisciplinary fields, they didn't join into this particular talk. Actually, they have not understood the continuity of things. So how do you think about that colonial debt is being continued even today in many countries? Because Africa, they say that it's still undergoing colonial debt to French and the Dutch countries. India, I don't know, the colonial resources are going maybe in terms of software engineers and this in this thing. How do you think that colonial debt is continuing, sir, actually?
The audio was not as good as I think, and I'm going to repeat what I think I heard you say, or perhaps somebody could help me. I think you said, how was
I think I can help. I think Professor, I think I can help.
Thank you.
Actually, my remark is also aligned with this Sankaran,
Thank you.
who is just spoken. Actually, he's trying to say, of course, there was exploitation during colonialization.
Very much
and,
so.
But our present governments are not doing better. You know, our in the development, industrialization, there is the extraction, the exploitation and colonial period. And how do we see as an anthropologist at this phenomenon? That's what Sankaran was about to ask, and that is also my remark, actually.
Because Indian country, there are some sections which are really working hard and they are really studying hard also, sir. But yet, 2 or 3 generations are really taking their toll to become a successful academician or a successful thing. 2 or 3 generations have to work so hard as they call the class laborers, the working class laborers. They are mocked in that manner, but their children are undergoing injustices. They are undergoing experiences, but the government mentality is going like they are brainwashing the dominant people as the people who are designing the futures of the working class, without even addressing, without even thanking them. For example, Professor Kanchayaleya of our culture from Hyderabad, from Telangana, he had written a very important book on the idea called Comatolu social smugglers. That means he has written a group and he called them as social smugglers, especially talking about how retail chain and everything was brought in order to destroy their own the local culture's hard work, actually. And they were reduced back to slaves, they were reduced back to working class, they were reduced back to people with wage labor, they were not brought to a better position. So there is constantly the media, everything is just used to brainwash people, saying that you belong here because I gave you the job. It's more like that, I want to say. It doesn't exist like everyone has got a dignity here. That's why I was talking about colonial debt, a neo-colonial form of thing, actually.
I very enjoy your intervention. And I think that you're right. I'm not an expert on South India. I've been influenced by the Frankfurt School. So I think that I'm more optimistic, and I'm also practitioner of Latin American anthropology. And Latin American, I think that we use media as a revolutionary tool, as a way of social change. And I think it's extremely creative. And Peruvian film, Mexican film, Peruvian film currently is outstanding. And it's a celebration of cultural diversity. It's a political act, but so you know, I think that I fully commend you, and I agree with your comments. So thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Can I intervene?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Professor Ambas, sir, please ask.
Actually, the question that you have raised is, well, settled long back. If you recall, during 50s, when the policy of tribals was being discussed, Verrier Elvin was commissioned to draft a policy with a specific reference to the Northeast Frontier Agency. NEFA, yeah.
Yes, sir.
So a document came out which was called a New Deal for NEFA.
Yes,
The major issue at that time was whether the tribal communities should be assimilated into the vast Indian culture, whether the tribals should be kept as isolation. I mean, they should be isolated and kept as their culture, their entity, their habitat should be preserved as like protected area, and they may become the museum piece. The third alternative was to integrate, retaining their culture, not interfering with their cultural and religious life, but at the same time making available all the kinds of developmental programs to them, and design these programs in a manner that their identity is maintained, and yet they reap the benefit of development. In that connection, there was a great debate, and then it was finally decided that we will integrate them into the Indian society, like various other communities that are there, like caste system, like the religious groupings, like Muslims and Christians. Similarly, each tribal community will should retain its cultural characteristics, but the tools of development, like the economic development, like the agricultural development. So in that context, tribal development blocks, if you remember, there were community development blocks, but tribal development blocks were created. And they were different from community development blocks because the accent on tribal areas on tribal development was making economic development available, retaining their cultural identity. So what you were referring just now, where you have to look back at that, and that has been the policy of the government. And any industrial development, whether in the coal belt or in other areas, there has been a concerted and deliberate effort not to vitiate their cultural moorings, but make the economic development available to them. I hope I have answered your question, if I have understood correctly. Thank you very much.
So I felt like I had some dichotomy. One is that the government was imposing a vision which was different from the tribal, and that was called governmentality, which in terms of misuse of power, which put out the neo-colonial state. And on the other hand, I was also asking about colonial debt, how colonial debt was being again followed from the colonized countries actually to the other. For example, Shashi Tharoor was telling about why India, the British owes reparations to India. That was a very good point. point to say about it. Even within the caste system also that is true, that why it is important for some people to owe reparation to them in terms of dignity. That's what Kanchaya was telling also in his work actually.
Yes, Professor N.K. Ambassador has brought very important insights. The anthropological contributions, Professor Verrier Elvin, how he was instrumental in facilitating the pro-tribal development policy and the inclusion, because the right to health, the right to education, the right to economic acquisition or development or empowerment, and the right to keep their cultural uniqueness, all these things are matters of concern, because they are our fellow humans to make the positive impact on the isolated tribal groups. And the governmental policy and how the anthropology was instrumental in facilitating, in advising the central government, the countrywide policy making. That is what we are looking as International Institute for of Anthropological Applications. We want to spread how anthropological knowledge and insights and methods are important in facilitating the positive change, and in helping people identify their weaknesses and identify their the strengths, and so that they voluntarily can choose the positive change. That is where the instrumentality of the anthropologist, that's where we want to equip the young scholars and students, and even have a facilitated dialogue among anthropology, academic anthropologists and practicing anthropologists, not only local, regional, but also global, so that this is one of the initiative to facilitate in that direction. Thank you, Professor Ambassador, Professor N.K. Ambassador, for your valuable.
Just one point I wanted to make, that the tribal development blocks, they were manned by people especially trained administrators who underwent training in tribal orientation study centers. There were 4 such centers. One was in Chhindwara, the other Ranchi. The third one was in Udaipur, and 4th was Bakshi Ka Talab, Lucknow. So these 4 centers were especially meant for those people, whether IAS or PCS, to undergo a training to work in tribal areas. So the government was very keen that we should not upset the tribal population, and yet the instrument of all developmental processes or procedures or developmental needs are met. So special anthropological trainings are given. And I happen to be on the faculty, guest faculty at Ranchi, and B.K. Rai, people like B.K. Rai Barban, L.P. Vidyarthi, Sachidanand was the director of the center also. So these people were there, and all the IAS and other people, they came for 3 months training to get into it. So thank you. I thought I would add this. Thank you very much.
That is incredible story that anthropology has built in Indian subcontinent. We want to deeply probe into that experiences, to document and to spread that experiences, how these important eminent anthropologists in India were facilitating this development policy and training the civil servants to deliver the good governance at the national level in their capacities. That was incredible. That is really fascinating. That's what we are looking for. In the long run, we want to assist the civil servants and policy makers and NGOs and industrialists and all sectors who are making their contribution for the well-being of the nations for their flourishments. The anthropology as a key stakeholder, and how it's wise to build its wise and to make the positive difference. Yeah, this is a story Professor N.K. Ambassador rightly brought into the rightly shared in the right time. So those stories we want to document and spread across the world. So the success stories, how anthropologists were instrumental in facilitating the empowerment of the local people for their positive benefits. So those success stories which are scattered across the globe, across the nations, those experiences and success stories, we want to build cases and publish it. So that the anthropological the insights, how they can make important contribution. So convincing stories. Yeah. Thank you, sir, Professor N.K. Ambassador.
One of the faculty of Tribal Orientation Study Center is living just about 500 yards from here. So let me explore if he can share some of his experiences, and then I will record it and then forward it to you.
Yes, sir, because you are an eminent the educational anthropologist from India, and who was the chairman for many years for the National Institute of Open Schooling. So being such an authority from anthropology and in educational policy facilitation, and your story, we will take interview and comprehensively. At the same time, the person whom you are referring to, we want to have an in-depth interview so that we don't want to miss any important details.
I will try to convince him to share his experiences. He to tell you very frankly, his name is A.A. Lal, and he was with the UNESCO also in Ethiopia, and with UNICEF here, besides being my colleague in the NCERT in the same department. So maybe he may be of great, I would say, his store of knowledge, although he has reclused himself in Puja Path, but I will persuade him to.
That will be a great thing, sir. Thank you. Please pursue.
Pardon me, Dr. Asmak. I really loved your intervention. And one of the wonderful things about Dr. Gade's and Dr. Roy's and Dr. Paul's efforts are that we will provide a platform for you to be exchanging your ideas for the North American, because I would love to invite you and we could discuss that, the history of Indian anthropology, which you are our central figure in that. So that's another discussion. So thank you ever so much for sharing that with us.
Incidentally, I may mention that I made a brief study of Tlingit Indians in Alaska on their educational problem and deculturization. So
This
that was under the aegis of...
I would like to invite you, as I was talking to Dr. Gade in North America, that's a done deal. So I'm going to be sending you an invitation for you to discuss your experiences either in India or in North America. But this is precisely why we're globalists. We study people across the planet. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Dean, Professor N.K. Ambassador is the first educational anthropologist in India. And he did his doctorate in education, tribal education.
I'm very aware of Dr. He's a foundational figure in establishing educational anthropology, and it's a great honor to be your student, Doctor. So thank you very much for participating in Dr. Gade's event. Thank you.
Yeah, he's our senior, he's our advisor. He serves on our advisory board of Anthropological Association for Humankind. It's so gracious. He is in his 80s, but still he thinks like a young man for anthropology, how to take forward. So his assistance and his presence on our advisory board makes excellent encouragement. Yeah. So yes, thank you so much. And any other person want to pose the question to Professor Dean?
I just want to thank you, Professor Dean. Your presentation was very clear, and your articulation was excellent, and the decoding of those digital footprints, like photographs, was a very anthropological articulation. I personally thank you very much for attending and giving this lecture.
Thank you, Raj. And I know that you and I have been in communication, and you work at a very, very important organization. And I hope that you and I can collaborate directly, because I've been reading some of your research. It's wonderful. And I think that Dr. Gada and I have had some very nice chats yesterday, and we're dreamers, and dreaming is good, because Dr. Pandita talked about hope. And I see in our group a tremendous amount of hope and a celebratory day, or for me, it's a celebratory day. For you, it'll be a celebratory evening. So I hope that you have happy dreams. I can assure you a very, very happy day, despite the sadness of the world. And it's because of the participation of individuals like you gives me hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Sir, can I give you a point? A small, very small point. Day before, a couple of days before, the Ministry of Education started a program called Shikshak Parva, that is Teachers Celebration, from 7th. On 8th International Literacy Day, they had invited me, and I made a presentation on digital literacy, emerging scenario in digital literacy. How, and I traced from right, the Neanderthal man and the development of language and to the modern. So if somebody is interested, one can go on YouTube, look at Shikshak Parva and digital literacy, and you will find about 15 minutes presentation and about 2-3 minutes of question answer. Because I was thinking in terms that with the changing scenario of script and languages, the emerging scene with regard to development and perspective, it might be necessary for us to be aware of and be prepared. But it is not specifically to the tribal areas, it is for all areas. So that was just point of information. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I intervened to let you know, but this is on the portal of the Ministry of Education.
For my intervention, I would love to review that, and Dr. Gotti will send me the link. And then my hope is that perhaps you could lecture on that topic here for the University of Kansas, because as Dr. Gotti had mentioned, we know that you're one of the founding figures of educational anthropology in India. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm greatly flattered, though I don't deserve it. Thank you very much.
So that's a wonderful invitation, Professor Dean. So Professor N.K. Boss sir is a worthy man, and he made a lot of improvements in the educational policy and at the country level. So he applied anthropology in that way. So educational anthropology, how anthropology is trained anthropologist can make a positive improvement in education. Many stories, we can hear from you.
For intervening yet again. Our other colleague, Dr. Jairam Kiran, who will subsequently join, he was trained as an educational anthropologist at Columbia, at Teachers College. So, so we do have a tremendous amount of expertise, I think, with our growing team, Indian international. So I look forward to hearing his interventions as well. He's taught me a tremendous amount, because as you know, Doctor, educational anthropology is a field in of itself, a very, very important field,
Exactly.
and extremely important. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So as Professor Dean rightly mentioned that recently Dr. Kiran Jairam sir joined the governing council. He is from the University of South Florida, who was introduced by Professor Ravindranath Dugirala. So, yeah, he's an educational anthropologist, and he also works on migrations and important contributions. And he is also trained in applied anthropology. So he worked for World Bank, and he was a chair.
Pardon me, Dr. Gotti. Given that he was my student as well, and I'm delighted. And Kiran is a delightful person because his father's South Indian, his mother was from Kansas, and so he's a very interesting individual. But he works on, you mentioned Hispaniola. Hispaniola is an island that half of it is the Dominican Republic, the other is Haiti. So he's a specialist on both Haiti and on the Dominican Republic. And he's married to a Haitian woman, and he lives in Florida. So he's truly a global citizen, but he's committed to world anthropologies. And we worked together for Venner Gren Foundation. We have worked in establishing the postgraduate program of anthropology in Port-au-Prince in Haiti. Unfortunately, as I perhaps don't need to tell you, there's a tremendous amount of political instability in Haiti, and he and I are still working on that. So we're devoted to institutional building. And so I'm sorry to put a plug in for my good friend and colleague, Kiran.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful, Professor Dean, that to learn that he is your student. Wow.
He's my colleague. He's my colleague at this point. And so I want to stress that he's my teacher.
Sir, can I say something? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
So, Sir Dean, you highlighted digitally the way of indigenous people of Amazon, very perfect way, in a very perfect way. Although America is a developed country in the world, but in some part of the country itself, lots of discriminated people also occur in such developed country. Actually, it is a very informative session for me. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I've had the good fortune to spend most of my life outside of the United States. So when you hear me speaking, think of me speaking not necessarily as a North American. I have a deep commitment for Peru. I teach at the National University of Peru. That's the first university of the Americas. It was founded. I'm a graduate of Harvard, but I teach at San Marcos. It was the first printing press. So I'm committed to what we're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. The person who posed the question right now, Dr. Kesam Somarani Devi is a committed student. Even though she is a faculty in the university department, so she regularly attends our sessions, digital ethnography, and without fail.
Lovely.
Very
lovely.
committed.
And lovely. And I'm a public anthropologist, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about that subsequently, what that means. Yeah,
we request you to offer this a course on public anthropology. That will be great, because in India we need it. Because in the public sphere, how anthropology can effectively and efficiently can engage with in the public sphere. That's what we need, the training. That is the bridge, actually.
Dr. Gotti, and pardon me for always interrupting, public anthropology is applied anthropology. And so in essence, it's just how do we use what we've been taught to make people's lives better? That's the key. And I feel that we should not just do it in the school, but we should do it in the public realm. And I think we all agree, and that's why we're doing this publicly. So thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, sir. Is there any other person ready to ask the question? Or any other remark?
I would like to end by encouraging any individual to send me via email questions or what's up, and I will be, to the best of my ability, to respond. Likewise, I hope you will respond to my questions because I have many of them. This exchange has made me think a lot, and I'm going to begin learning much more about the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Islands, and also South India, and Stanley Tambai, and all sorts of teachers that I've had in the past, and reconnect with my Indian roots, so to speak, because ultimately we're all connected. We're all human beings. So thank you, Dr. Gade, for giving me the opportunity to share with your esteemed colleagues this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bartholomew Crispin Dean, sir, for taking valuable time and sharing with us the new knowledge about Amazonia and the people, how they were exploited, and how the historical and diachronic approaches you brought, and the visual anthropological insights, and how things can really build the story, helpful in their building their stories. And this is recorded, so it will be available for the entire peoples of the world. So that's how the archiving the digital resources of the world, different stories from the corners of the world. This is the good beginning, and it has begun. The story has begun. So applied anthropological stories from different parts of the world. So in future, and I encourage your colleagues and much more inputs from your side and from our Indian side and from different other European countries. And we want to have that rich stories so that we can delight in the anthropological applications, how they make the positive differences in the lives of the peoples of the world. Thank you so much. Thank you, dear.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ambassador, and thank you, Professor Rice, sir, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All the participants.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Good evening. Bye-bye.